What was the Great Famine?
Typically the term refers to the Great Irish Famine, which began in 1845. That year crops failed across Europe, resulting in widespread hunger and disease, claiming 2.5 million lives. The famine was especially severe in Ireland, where many peasants exported their grain and millet and depended on potatoes for their own sustenance. The failure of the potato crop in 1845 was the 20th in Ireland since 1727. And it marked the beginning of the Great Famine, which lasted into 1848 due to more disastrous crop failures each successive year. The crops had failed due to blight, previously unknown to Ireland, which was caused by a microscopic organism. Fungus, believed to have been introduced by a ship from North America. British charity and government relief did little to alleviate the suffering. The resulting famine was responsible for a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to death and emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland, and nearly 2 million people left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. Other severe, or great, famines include one in 1769 in Bengal. The disaster claimed the lives of 10 million Asian Indians, one-third of the population. In 1878 up to 20 million Chinese people died as a 2-year drought held Asia in its grips, causing widespread crop failures. It is still considered the worst famine in history.
What is the Treaty of Paris?
There has been more than one Treaty of Paris. The following international agreements were signed in the French capital. In 1763, representatives of Great Britain, France, and Spain signed a treaty, which, along with the Treaty of Hubertusburg, February 15, 1763, ended the 7 Years' War, 1756–63. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris, which had been under negotiation since 1782, was signed by the British and the Americans, represented by statesman Benjamin Franklin. 1706–1790, John Adams, 1735–1826, and John Jay, 1745–1829. The agreement officially ended the American Revolution, 1775–83, establishing the United States as an independent country and drawing the boundaries of the new nation, which extended west to the Mississippi River, north to Canada, east to the Atlantic Ocean, and south as far as Florida, which was given to Spain. In 1814 and 1815 treaties were signed ending the Napoleonic Wars, which the French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte 1769–1821, had begun shortly after taking power in 1799. In 1856 European nations signed a treaty in Paris ending the Crimean War, 1853–56, and outlawing the wartime practice of privateering. The Treaty of Paris that was signed December 10, 1898, settled the conflict that had resulted in the Spanish-American War, 1898. This treaty provided for Cuba's full independence from Spain. It also granted control of Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. The pact further stipulated that the United States would pay Spain $20 million for the Philippine Islands. In 1951, in the wake of World War II, 1939–45, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany signed the Treaty of Paris, which established the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC. The desire was to bring about economic and political unity among the democratic nations of Europe. This agreement paved the way for the European Union affected by the Maastricht Treaty, an economic agreement signed by representatives of 12 European countries in the Netherlands in 1992.
Who invented basketball?
The ball and hoop game was invented by Canadian-American James Naismith, 1861–1939, in December 1891. An instructor at the YMCA College in Springfield, Massachusetts, Naismith was asked by the head of the physical education department to come up with a game to keep students active indoors during the winter months. It had to fit inside the confines of a gym, have no physical contact, use a soft ball, and give everyone who participated a chance to handle the ball. Naismith nailed 2 peach baskets, which he found in the storeroom, to balcony railings at each end of the school's gym. Found a soccer ball, divided his class of 18 men into 2 teams, and introduced the man as it would turn out. The rest of the world to the game, which was later dubbed basketball, 2 words. Improvements to the game came over the next 2 decades as it spread in popularity. In 1910 the important change of allowing ball handlers to move by dribbling was made. In 1916 the rules were changed to allow dribblers to shoot the ball.
Are the adventures of Marco Polo true?
Most of the tales are accepted as true and accurate by modern scholars. It is only those accounts that deal with places where it is not known that Marco Polo traveled, such as Africa, that are seen as legend rather than fact. Upon his return to Venice in 1295, Marco Polo, 1254–1324, took up the family occupation and worked as a merchant. 3 years later, he was on board a ship that was captured by a rival Genoese ship. He was subsequently imprisoned in the port city of Genoa, where he met a writer named Rustichello, or Rusticiano, from the Italian city of Pisa. Polo recounted his stories to Rustichello, who wrote them down and published them as the Diversament do Monde, Description of the World. The book was an immediate popular success and became one of the most important sources of Western knowledge of the East. Readers today know the stories as the travels of Marco Polo.
What were the international contributions to the War on Terror?
According to the U.S. Central Command, by early 2005 there were 70 nations supporting the global war on terror. And 21 nations had deployed more than 16,000 troops to the U.S.-led operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Coalition forces contributed in a variety of ways, including providing intelligence, personnel, security assistance, equipment, and other assets for use in ground, air, and sea operations. Coalition members also provided humanitarian aid to civilians.
Why was the Titanic thought to be unsinkable?
The RMS Titanic was state-of-the-art, a huge and luxurious ocean liner equipped with the latest and best. The ship's size afforded it great stability, its structure included more steel than had been used in previous ships. It was built with a double bottom, both skins were heavier and thicker than those of other ships. The hull was divided by 15 bulkheads, upright partitions, that rose 5 decks forward and aft, back, and 4 decks midship. These transverse bulkheads divided the ship into 16 compartments watertight. Chambers, any 2 of which could take on water without sinking the ship. This marvel of modern technology, which was to be the jewel in the crown of the White Star Line, was given a fitting name. Titanic is a Greek word meaning having great force or power, and it was described as practically unsinkable. However, the ship designer did not and could not prepare the ship for what happened on the night of April 14, 1912. Just before midnight, the Titanic was speeding at 21 knots through the North Atlantic. Even though the crew had been warned by other ships that the unusually calm waters were full of ice. When the Titanic's 2 watchmen, who were not using binoculars, sighted an iceberg in the ship's path, it was only a quarter-mile away. The ship was turned to the port, left, but it was too late. The underwater shelf of the ice tore through the plating on the starboard, right, side of the ship. Thin slits developed at the seams in the ship's hull, allowing seawater to enter. The effect was similar to filling an ice tray with water, once one watertight chamber had filled. The rushing water spilled over the top and into the next. Titanic came to symbolize human arrogance. The ship owners and operators believed the Titanic was impervious to nature. Consequently, the ocean liner had not been equipped with the number of lifeboats needed to rescue everyone on board. Titanic's lifeboats had room for about half the passengers. Since there had been no safety drills on board, many lifeboats were launched only half full. The enormous loss of life, which included society's most prominent individuals as well as ordinary families who were immigrating to America, stands out as one of the great tragedies in the history of transportation.
What were fiefs?
A fief was an estate that was owned, governed, and protected by a lord. A fief consisted of several manors, each of which might have had its own lord, and their villages, along with all buildings on the land as well as the peasants, serfs, who worked the land, served at court, or took up arms on behalf of the lord. The lord of the fief, called a feudal lord, would secure the allegiance of the manorial lords, sometimes called seigneurs, who would in turn secure the allegiance of the peasants. In short, land was exchanged for loyalty. This was feudalism. The political and economic system of the Middle Ages, 500-1350. The word feud is of Germanic origin and means fee. In repayment for the land they lived on and for the protection they received from the lord. Serfs were expected to pay the lord fees in the form of money, taxes, services, or goods. The feudal system arose in the 7th century. It was suspended during the Carolingian Empire, which began in 751 when a series of powerful kings, including Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742 to 814, united much of Western Europe. But after Charlemagne died in 814, his grandsons fought each other and later divided the vast kingdom among themselves. Each of their territories later came under attack, dissolving Carolingian rule. By the 9th century, feudalism had replaced the Carolingian Empire as the political and economic entity governing medieval life. Feudalism lasted into the 15th century.
Who invented the first personal computer?
Development of the personal computer, PC, a microcomputer designed to be used by one person, was first developed for business use in the early 1970s. Digital Equipment Corporation developed the PDP-8, which was predominantly used in scientific laboratories. The credit for development of a computer for home use goes to Steve Wozniak, 1950. And Steve Jobs, 1955, college dropouts who founded Apple Computer in 1976. They spent 6 months working out of a garage, developing the crude prototype for Apple I, which was bought by some 600 hobbyists who had to know how to wire, program, and set up the machine. Its successor, Apple II, was introduced in 1977 as the first fully assembled programmable microcomputer, but it still required customers to use their televisions as screens and to use audio cassettes for data storage. It retailed for just less than $1. 300 That same year, Commodore and Tandy introduced affordable personal computers. In 1984, Apple Computer introduced the Macintosh, Mac, which became the first widely used computer with a graphical user interface, GUI. By this time, International Business Machines, IBM, had introduced its PC, 1981, which quickly overtook the Mac. in spite of the fact that IBM was behind in developing a user-friendly graphical interface.
What were serfs?
Serfs were the peasants who lived on either a manor or a fief. The two organizing entities of the Middle Ages, 500-1350. They performed labor and were bound to the lord of the property where they lived and worked. A serf was somewhere between a free person and a slave, though the word serf is derived from the Latin word servus. Meaning slave, the serfs had certain rights, which were governed not by law but by custom. One such custom was that a serf who could escape his lord for 1 year and a day was then considered free. A free peasant was called a villein, a village commoner.
What was the Bay of Pigs?
Bay of Pigs is the name of an unsuccessful 1961 invasion of Cuba, which was backed by the U.S. government. About 1,500 Cuban expatriates living in the United States had been supplied with arms and trained by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. On April 17, 1961, the group of men who opposed the regime of Cuba's Fidel Castro, 1926, landed at the Bahia de Coquinos, Bay of Pigs, in west-central Cuba. Most of the rebels were captured by the Cuban forces, others were killed. In order to secure the release of the more than 1,100 men who had been captured during the invasion, private donors in the United States accumulated $53 million in food and medicine, which was given to Castro's government in exchange for the rebels' release. The failed invasion came as a terrible embarrassment to the Kennedy administration, and many believe the Bay of Pigs incident directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
What happened in Grenada?
On October 24, 1983, about 3,000 U.S. Marines and U.S. Army Rangers landed on the Caribbean island. The number included about 300 military personnel from neighboring Antigua, Barbados, Dominica, Jamaica, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. The arrival followed the October 12 through 19 coup in which Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, 1943 to 1983, was overthrown and killed by a hardline Marxist military council headed by General Hudson Austin. While the United Nations and Friends of the United States condemned President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, for the action, American troops detained General Austin and restored order on the island. Governor-General Sir Paul Scoon, 1935, formed an interim government to prepare for elections. Most of the U.S. military presence was withdrawn by December 1983, with nominal forces remaining on the island through most of 1985. President Reagan justified the tactic by citing that the coup had put in danger American students on the island. But prevailing political conditions on tiny Grenada were more likely to have inspired the show of force. Increasingly stronger ties between Grenada and Cuba had made many American officials nervous. They feared the island would be used as a way station for shipping Soviet and Cuban arms to Central America.
What were the harshest blizzards to hit the United States?
Regions of the United States, particularly the Great Plains, Midwest, and New England, typically experience extreme winter weather, but some storms do stand out. In March 1888, the Northeast was hit by a blizzard dubbed the Great White Hurricane. After a warm spell that had caused the buds to open on trees in New York's Central Park. On March 12, the temperature in the city plummeted to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds off the Atlantic built up to 48 miles per hour, bringing unpredicted snow that continued intermittently until the early morning of March 14. The three-day accumulation totaled 20.9 inches, and snow drifts 15 to 20 feet high halted traffic. The snowfall was even greater elsewhere, averaging 40 inches or more in parts of southeastern New York and southern New England. The storm extended down into Chesapeake Bay, isolating the nation's capital from the world for more than a day. 200 ships were lost or grounded, and at least 100 died at sea. A total of at least 400 people died, half of them in New York City alone. Just 2 months before this nor'easter, another blizzard had swept through the Great Plains, moving eastward into Minnesota. There, high winds, blowing snow, and sudden drops in temperature combined to make it a dangerous storm, killing many people and thousands of cattle. The Great Blizzard of 1993 caused loss of life and extensive damage all along the eastern seaboard, from Maine to Florida. More than 300 people died, almost 50 of them at sea, and economic losses totaled $3 to $6 billion. While several so-called 100-year storms have bombarded the East Coast in the 1990s alone, there had been another just a few months earlier, in December 1992. The statistics of the March 1993 storm are impressive indeed, probably qualifying it as the storm of the century. Wind gusts exceeded 75 miles per hour all along the East Coast, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour were measured at various points, including Flat Top, North Carolina. Tennessee saw the highest snowfall of the storm, with 56 inches at Mount LeConte. Snowfall amounts were also heavy in the Northeast, but snow accumulated as far south as the Florida Panhandle. Experts estimated that the amount of water that fell, in the form of snow, was equivalent to 40 days' flow of the mighty Mississippi River past New Orleans. According to record low barometer readings, this storm surpassed Hurricanes Hugo, 1989, and Hazel, 1954. However, Midwesterners and residents of the northern Great Plains could argue that Storms such as the Great Blizzard of 1993 are relatively common in their regions. To wit, another storm that could easily vie for the title storm of the century occurred January 10 to 11, 1975. In the upper Midwest, the blizzard was accompanied by winds of 90 miles per hour and wind chills as low as -80 degrees Fahrenheit. Trains were stranded in snowdrifts, and at least 80 people died. Ranchers and farmers were hard hit, losing some 55,000 head of livestock.
Who were the leaders of abolition?
Leaders of the anti-slavery movement included journalist William Lloyd Garrison, 1805 to 1879. Founder of the influential anti-slavery journal The Liberator and of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Established 1833, brothers Arthur, 1786 to 1865, and Lewis, 1788 to 1873, Tappan. Prominent New York merchants who were also founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and Theodore Dwight Weld. 1803 to 1895, leader of student protests, organizer of the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, and author of The Bible Against Slavery, 1837, and other abolitionist works. Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman, c. 1820 to 1913, worked against slavery by helping to free hundreds of blacks who escaped slavery in the South. Heading for northern states and Canada. Writers such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, 1811-1896, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1851-52. Helped strengthen the abolitionist cause and were instrumental in swaying public sentiment. In the hands of some activists, the movement became violent. In 1859, ardent abolitionist John Brown, 1800 to 1859, led a raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry, in present-day West Virginia, which proved a failed attempt to emancipate slaves by force.
Who was more important to rock and roll, Elvis Presley or the Beatles?
While music historians and fans of either or both may be willing to offer an opinion, the question cannot be definitively answered. The fact is that popular music today would not be what it is had it not been for both Elvis Presley and the Beatles. And the influences of both are still felt. Elvis Presley, 1935 to 1977, brought to music an exciting and fresh combination of country, gospel, blues, and rhythm and blues music, and topped it all off with a style and sense of showmanship that dazzled young audiences. His first commercial recording was That's All Right, Mama in 1954. Which was followed in 1956 by the success of Heartbreak Hotel. Between 1956 and 1969 he had 17 number-one records. Presley defined a new musical style and an era. Among those the American Presley had influenced were four English musicians who called themselves the Beatles. Originally founded as the Quarrymen by John Lennon, 1940 to 1980, in 1956. The group became the most popular rock and roll band of the 1960s. Their first single was Love Me Do, released on October 5, 1962, and producer George Martin was encouraged that the Beatles could produce a #1 record. In 1963 they did. Please Please Me was released in Britain on January 12 and was an immediate hit. Other hits off their first album included She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. The follow-up album, With the Beatles, was released in 1964 and established them as Britain's favorite group. Already popular in their homeland, Beatlemania began in the United States on February 7, 1964, when the mop-topped Fab Four, Lennon along with Paul McCartney, b. 1942, George Harrison, 1943 to 2001, and Ringo Starr, b. 1940, arrived at New York's Kennedy International Airport and were met by a mob of more than 10,000 screaming fans and 110 police officers. 2 days later, on February 9, the Beatles made their legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. By April the group held onto the top 5 positions on the US singles charts. The British invasion had begun. In their early years, the Beatles brought a new energy to rock and roll and picked up where Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard had left off. The instrumentation and orchestration of Beatles songs, for which their producer George Martin deserves at least some of the credit, were innovative at the time, and are common for rock music today. Their rock movies, A Hard Day's Night, 1964, and Help, 1965, were a precursor to the music videos of today. When the band decided to break up, the April 10, 1970, announcement proved to be the end of an era.
How did Mother Teresa begin her life's work?
Born Agnes Gonca Bohakiou in August 1910 in Skopje, in present-day Macedonia. The woman the world knew as Mother Teresa had by age 12 realized that she would spend her life aiding the poor. At age 18 she left her family to pursue that mission, joining a community of Irish nuns who were missionaries in Calcutta, India. There she took the name Sister Teresa and began teaching at St. Mary's High School, which she would continue to do for the next 17 years. She took her final vows as a nun in 1937. In 1946 she became ill and was believed to have contracted tuberculosis. Sent to Darjeeling in northeast India to recover, she was on a train when she heard the call to give up all and follow him to the slums to serve him among the poorest of the poor. In 1948 Pope Pius XII, 1876 to 1958, allowed Sister Teresa to leave her order and pursue this mission. In 1950, after receiving some medical training, she founded the Order of Missionaries of Charity in Calcutta. 2 years later she opened a home for the dying poor. It was called Nirmal Hriday, or Pure Heart. 1 year after that she opened her first orphanage. It was the children there who called her Mother Teresa, or sometimes simply Mother. She spent her life helping the sick and the outcast, who she described as Christ in distressing disguise. Small in stature, she was frail and in poor health in her final years. But she continued her work nevertheless. It was not until March 1997, just months before her death, that she finally stepped down as head of her order. Having started with only 12 members, the Missionaries of Charity had grown to include more than 4,000 nuns who continued to run orphanages and hospices around the world. Mother Teresa died on September 5 of that year. She was 87.
What are the origins of slavery in America?
The roots of slavery in North America date back to about 1400, when the Europeans arrived in Africa. At first, the result of African contact with Europeans was positive, opening trade routes and expanding markets. Europeans profited from Africa's rich mineral and agricultural resources and for a while abided by local laws governing their trade. Africans benefited from new technologies and products brought by the Europeans. But the relationship between the two cultures soon turned disastrous as the Europeans cast their attention on a decidedly different African resource, the people themselves. As the Portuguese in West and East Africa began trading in human lives and the Dutch in South Africa clashed with the native people who, once displaced by the wars, became servants and slaves. Other Europeans began calculating the profits that could be made in the slave trade. By the end of the 1400s, Europeans had landed in the New World. Soon Europe's established and emerging powers vied for control of territories in the new lands of North and South America and the West Indies. The Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutch, English, and Swedes all made claims in the Western Hemisphere and began setting up colonies. By the mid-1600s, triangular patterns of trade emerged. The most common route began on Africa's west coast, where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners and traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits before traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows: 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the route began again, and 2, lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the route began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of the triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the forced migration of Africans to the Western Hemisphere.
What was drive? Mud tried for?
A doctor who treated the broken ankle of John Wilkes Booth, 1838 to 1865, after Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln. On April 14, 1865, he died the next day. Samuel Mudd was later charged as an accomplice in the president's assassination and was charged with treason and conspiracy. He was tried before a military commission and on June 30, 1865, was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. 3 years later Mudd was pardoned by President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875. The official reason for the pardon was Mudd's humanitarian efforts to save lives during a prison epidemic. But the case against him had been flimsy at best, and history has credited the guilty verdict to overly ambitious politics and a commission bent on retribution. Nevertheless, Mudd's name remained tainted, giving the popular culture the phrase, "His name is Mudd."
What happened to the Philippines after they were ceded by Spain?
After the United States gained control of the Philippines in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, the Pacific archipelago was soon embroiled in a conflict similar to the one in Cuba, which had developed into the Spanish-American War. Filipinos, determined to achieve independence, revolted in an uprising that lasted from 1899 to 1901. A civil government was established on the Philippines in 1901, and in November 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was officially established. However, the islands would continue to be the site of conflict in the coming decades, as the United States again struggled with a foreign power. This time the Japanese for control of the islands during World War II, 1939 to 45.
Which artists and thinkers are considered the greatest minds of the Renaissance?
The great writers of the Renaissance include the Italian poet Petrarch, 1304–1374, who became the first great writer of the Renaissance and was one of the first proponents of the concept that a rebirth was in progress. Florentine historian Niccolò Machiavelli, 1469–1527, who wrote the highly influential work The Prince. 1513, English dramatist and poet William Shakespeare, 1564–1616. Whose works many view as the culmination of Renaissance writing, Spain's Miguel de Cervantes, 1547–1616, who penned Don Quixote. 1605, the epic masterpiece that gave birth to the modern novel, and Frenchman François Rabelais, c. 1483–1553, who is best known for writing the 5-volume novel Gargantua and Pantagruel. The great artists of the Renaissance include the Italian painters/sculptors Sandro Botticelli, 1445–1510. Whose works include The Birth of Venus, Leonardo da Vinci, 1452–1519. Whose Mona Lisa and The Last Supper are among the most widely studied works of art, Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475–1564. Whose sculpture David became the symbol of the New Florence, and Raphael Sanzio, 1483–1520. Whose school of Athens is considered by art historians to be the complete statement of the High Renaissance.
What was Operation Falcon?
It was the code name for the mid-April 2005 roundup of more than 10,000 fugitives in 1 week. The coordinated nationwide effort was led by the U.S. Marshals Service, together with officers from 960 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The marshals arrested 10,340 people who were wanted for various crimes, many of them violent. The operation took place during Crime Victims' Rights Week. More than 150 of the fugitives were wanted for murder, 550 for sexual assault charges, and more than 600 for armed robberies. There were also escaped prisoners and criminal suspects among those arrested. Operation Falcon was a landmark in law enforcement because of the sheer number of arrests. Previous coordinated efforts had nabbed only hundreds of fugitives.
Why is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales important to literature?
The unfinished work, which was begun about 1486 and written during the last 14 years of its author's life, is considered a masterpiece of Middle English, the language spoken by Anglo-Saxons in England from c. 1200 into the late 1400s. In the Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340–1400, who was the son of a wealthy wine merchant, weaves together stories told by 28 pilgrims whom the storyteller, the poet himself, met at an inn. The pilgrims, along with the innkeeper who joins them and the poet, represent all facets of English social life: aristocracy, clergy, commoners, and even a middle class, which was not officially recognized by the social structure of the day, but which, in fact, existed. To connect the tales, Chaucer uses the framing device of a journey to the shrine of Thomas Becket, c. 1118 to 1170, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who in 1170 was killed by overzealous knights in the service of England's King Henry II. In his prologue, Chaucer indicates that each traveller was to tell two tales out and two tales back from the reader's ability to comprehend reality. Canterbury Cathedral, for a total of 120 stories, which were intended to entertain the pilgrims during their trip. But Chaucer wrote only 24 tales, 2 of which are incomplete. The tales include bawdy humor, fables, and lessons. While the pilgrims reach the shrine, they do not return, a device some scholars have interpreted as deliberate on the author's part, as it suggests the human journey from earth to heaven. Whatever the intention, the Canterbury Tales reveal the author's ability as a storyteller. As the editors of the Norton Anthology of English Literature assert, rivaling Shakespeare in the art of providing entertainment on the most primitive level, and at the same time, of significantly increasing the tales, were extremely popular in late medieval England. Printed and reprinted numerous times, particularly during the 1400s. Chaucer's rendering of details reveal both story and storyteller, pilgrim, at once, giving the reader a remarkable insight into the characters and revealing basic human paradoxes which transcend time.
What were the killing fields?
After Communist leader Pol Pot, 1928 to 1998, head of the Khmer Rouge, took over the Cambodian government in 1975, he ordered a collectivization drive, rounding up anyone who was believed to have been in collusion with or otherwise supported the former regime of Lon Nol, 1913 to 1985. The government instituted executions, forced labor, in so-called re-education camps, and famine combined to kill 1 in every 5 Cambodians, or an estimated 2 million people, during Pol Pot's reign. He was removed from power in the Vietnamese invasion of 1978 to 1979, and he died in hiding. In 1998. On December 29 of that year, 2 former Khmer Rouge leaders surrendered to authorities. Q Sam Phan, age 67, and Nguyen Chia, 71. The two appeared in a televised news conference. Asked if he was sorry for the suffering that claimed the lives of millions of Cambodians, Q Sam Phan looked straight at the questioner and answered in English, "Yes, sorry, very sorry." Nguyen Chia said, "We are very sorry. Not just for the human lives but also animal lives that were lost in the war." However, neither Sam Phan nor Chia accepted personal responsibility for the killing fields. While Sam Phan pled not to be tried for his crimes and Prime Minister Hun Sen, 1950, of Cambodia seemed inclined toward closing the book on this dark chapter in the country's history. There was public outcry to bring the former Khmer leaders to justice. Supporters of a trial assert that Cambodia will have no peace until someone is punished for the killing fields for the Khmer's genocidal regime.
What was abscom?
Abscom was an undercover operation conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), to ferret out corrupt government officials and prosecute them. In 1978, agents began posing as American representatives of Arab businessmen whose company, the fictitious Abdul Enterprises Limited, was willing to buy political influence in the United States. Abscom comes from the first two letters of the business name, with the word scam added to the end. The trap was set. The first to be caught was Congressman Michael Ozzie Myers, 1943, of Pennsylvania, who was videotaped accepting a $50,000 bribe and saying, "I'm going to tell you something real simple and short: money talks in this business." Other officials also fell prey to the sting operation. All of them were arrested on charges of bribery and conspiracy. The first of 7 trials got underway in 1980. None of the officials were acquitted. Most faced fines and/or imprisonment, and all of them lost their offices. The wide net cast by Abscom had caught 1 U.S. Senator, 6 representatives in Congress, 1 mayor, 3 members of the Philadelphia City Council, 1 INS. Immigration and Naturalization Service inspector, 1 lawyer, 1 accountant, and many of their associates. The FBI operation and the resulting trials and punishments sent a loud warning to any public official subject to influence.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit 2 object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
Was the Civil War fought because of slavery?
For years, American school children learned that the question of slavery was the only cause of the Civil War. 1861 to 65, with 19 free states and 15 slave states making up the Union. Abraham Lincoln. 1809 to 1865, had called the country a house divided even before he became president. While slavery was central to the conflict, many believe the bloody 4-year war had other causes as well. By the mid-1800s, important differences had developed between the South and the North, and many maintain these differences, or vestiges of them, are still with the country today. The economy in the South was based on agriculture while the North was industrialized. The ideals and lifestyles of each region reflected these economic realities. Southerners believed their agrarian lifestyle was dependent on the labor of slaves. For a long time, slavery was viewed by some as a necessary evil. But by the early 1800s the view that slavery is morally wrong was beginning to take hold. Northern abolitionists had begun a movement to end slavery in the states. But, except for a small anti-slavery faction, these views were not shared in the South. There were other factors that contributed to the declaration of secession and the formation of the Confederacy. Although some still argue these factors were merely smokescreens for the defense of slavery. Disputes between the federal government and the states had limited the power of the states. And this policy was called into question by Southerners. Further, the political party system was in disarray in mid-1850s America. The disorder prompted feelings of distrust for the elected politicians who set national policy. Before the 1860 presidential election, Southern leaders urged that the South secede from the Union if Lincoln, who had publicly taken a stand against slavery, won.
Were any countries besides Switzerland neutral during World War II?
Yes, in its official stance of neutrality, Switzerland was joined by Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, and Argentina. However, post-war findings indicated the neutrality of these countries, with the exception of Argentina, was not an absolute policy. Some have described these countries as only nominally neutral. A 1998 report released by U.S. Under-Secretary of State Stuart Eizenstat indicated that the Swiss had converted Nazi gold to Swiss francs, and that Germany had used that exchange to buy minerals from Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Turkey. The report further pointed out that Sweden had allowed 250,000 Nazi troops to cross its country in order to reach neighboring Finland, where the Germans fought Soviet forces. Eisenstadt, who headed a U.S. government effort to determine where Nazi gold ended up, was assisted in his research by State Department historians. Although the investigation's reports were critical of these neutral countries, Eisenstadt also pointed out that all the countries were in difficult positions during the conflict. For example, Switzerland was completely surrounded by German-occupied countries. Nevertheless, Jewish groups brought lawsuits against the Swiss government and 3 Swiss banks for their role in converting looted Nazi gold into currency during World War II.
What was the May 4th movement?
It was a mass movement that emerged in China after May 4, 1919, when students in Beijing protested one of the outcomes of the peace conference held at Versailles earlier that year to officially settle World War I, 1914-18 Japan. which had seized German territories in China during the war, was given control of the holdings. Student demonstrators criticized a weakened Chinese government for allowing the Japanese occupation. Following the death of powerful leader Yuan Shikai, 1859–1916. The country's central government crumbled. In northern China, local military leaders, called warlords, rose to power, continually challenging the authority of the capital at Beijing. Meanwhile, revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen, 1866–1925, had begun promoting his three great principles: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood in southern China, where he gained the support of military leaders in the region. At about the same time, Chinese intellectuals had begun attacking traditional culture and society, urging government reforms and the modernization of industry. The May 4th movement fanned the fires of revolution. The movement would have far-reaching and unforeseen results. And some might argue that the story has not yet played out. In 1919, Sun reorganized the Kuomintang, nationalist, party and began recruiting student followers. 2 years later he became president of a self-proclaimed national government of the Southern Chinese Republic, establishing the capital at Guangzhou, Canton. His sights were set on conquering northern China, toppling the northern warlords to reunify the country. In 1924 Sun began cooperating with both the Soviets and the communist groups that had been formed by students following the 1919 protest. Under Sun's leadership, the Nationalist Party began preparing for war. But Sun, who is regarded as the father of modern China, would not live to see the culmination of his plans. He died of cancer in 1925. Under military leader Chiang Kai-shek, 1887–1975. The Kuomintang turned on its communist members, whose leaders fled in fear of the Generalissimo. In 1928, following a 2-year military campaign, Chiang led the nationalists to capture Beijing, reuniting China under one government for the first time in 12 years. His rule of China lasted until 1949, when communists won control of the mainland and Mao Zedong, 1893–1976, became the first chairman of the People's Republic of China. The expelled Chiang and his followers established a Chinese nationalist government on the island of Taiwan. Back on the mainland, Mao's great leap forward, his massive collectivization of agriculture and industry, brought economic failure and a 2-year famine to China in the late 1950s.
Is anthrax a new disease?
No, the disease dates back thousands of years, at least to biblical times. But its potential use as a bioterrorism weapon is relatively recent. Anthrax is caused by the Bacillus anthracis bacterium, spores that can survive in soil for years. It is mainly a disease of grass-eating livestock. But humans who work with herd animals may become infected through exposure. In humans, Anthrax occurs as a cutaneous, skin, form, as a pulmonary, inhaled form, or as an intestinal infection after the consumption of contaminated meat. The fifth and sixth plagues on Egypt, as described in Exodus chapters 9, the pestilence and 10, the boils, are consistent with anthrax in livestock and humans. In the late 1800s, scientists made several important discoveries regarding anthrax. The anthrax germ, Bacillus anthracis, was the first germ linked to a particular disease. In 1881, French scientist Louis Pasteur developed an inoculation to protect animals from the disease. Anthrax emerged as a potential weapon of bioterrorism during the 20th century. Several countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, Iraq, and the former Soviet Union experimented with the bacterium. Beginning in the 1990s, U.S. troops headed for combat in the Persian Gulf were vaccinated for anthrax.
What were newsreels?
Newsreels got their start in 1910 when the pioneer film newsreel Path Gazette was shown in Britain and the United States. French cinematographer Charles Path, 1863 to 1957, and his brother Émile, 1860 to 1937, were Paris agents for the Edison phonograph. They visited London to acquire filmmaking equipment and secured financial support in order to set up production units in Britain, the United States, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. These short movies, covering current events, were predominantly used during wartime and were shown in theaters before motion pictures were shown. Superseded by television newscasts, the last newsreels were screened in 1967.
What is the Zero Population Growth Movement?
Abbreviated ZPG, it's an international movement for population control. It had its beginnings in an organization formed in 1968 called Zero Population Growth, which was established with the help of American biologist Paul Ehrlich, 1932. In his book The Population Bomb, 1968, Ehrlich argues that the world's population is growing at a pace that will outstrip its supply of natural resources, reaching the conclusion that overpopulation will inevitably cause widespread starvation and death. While his critics charge that this is an oversimplification of the situation, Ehrlich and others who subscribe to his views argue that overpopulation may not be the only factor leading to a severe shortage of natural resources around the globe, but it surely is the most important. The movement urges parents to have no more than 2 children, at this rate, called a replacement rate, there would be no population growth. In the late 1990s, researchers reported that in the United States and in much of Europe, the birth rate is below replacement level, while in some of the world's poorer countries, The average birth rate can be as high as 8 children per woman.
Why was the Dred Scott decision important?
The decision in the case of Dred Scott pronounced the Missouri Compromise 1820 unconstitutional and served to deepen the divide between North and South, helping pave the way for the Civil War, 1861–65. In the mid-1800s Dred Scott, c. 1795–1858, who had been born into slavery in Virginia, tried to claim his freedom on the basis that he had traveled with his owner, a doctor. In Wisconsin and Illinois, where slavery had been prohibited by the Missouri Compromise. By the Compromise, Congress decided to admit Missouri as a slavery state and Maine as a free state, and declared that the territories north of the 36th parallel, present-day Missouri's southern border, were free, with the exception of the state of Missouri. After a lifetime of slavery, Dred Scott sued Missouri for his freedom in April 1846. The case, which hinged on Scott's travels in free territories in the North, went through 2 trials. The second was granted due to a procedural error in the first. In 1850, at the conclusion of the second trial, a Missouri jury ruled Scott a free man based on precedents that indicated residence in a free territory or state resulted in emancipation, regardless of the fact that Missouri itself was a slave state. John F. A. Sanford, the lawyer for Scott's owner, immediately appealed the decision before the Missouri Supreme Court, where a pro-slavery judge reversed the ruling, rescinding Scott's freedom. But the case was not over yet, because Sanford had filed the court papers under his own name rather than that of Scott's former owner, the case of Scott v. Sanford. Because of a filing error, the case is also rendered as Scott v. Sanford, took an interesting twist. Scott hired a new lawyer who was able to get the case before the federal court. Sanford had moved to New York, and since the appellant, Scott, and the registered defendant, Sanford, were now residents of different states, the case came under federal purview. In 1854 a circuit court in St. Louis again heard Dred Scott's case, but his freedom was again denied. This decision was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which began hearing the case in 1856. In March 1857 the Supreme Court, which had a Southern majority, ruled that Scott's residence in Wisconsin and Illinois did not make him free, that a black, a Negro descended from slaves, had no rights as an American citizen and therefore could not bring suit in a federal court, and that Congress never had the authority to ban slavery in the territories. Dred Scott died the following year.
Who said, "We have met the enemy and they are ours"?
It was Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, 1785–1819, who wrote the famous words in a letter to General William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, after defeating the British at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813. An improvised U.S. squadron commanded by Captain Perry, 28 years old, achieved the victory in the War of 1812 battle. The message he sent to Harrison, who later went on to become the 9th U.S. President, was: "We have met the enemy and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." Perry received a gold medal and thanks from Congress for the victory.
How old is the World Wide Web?
The web, which adds an ease-of-use layer to the Internet by providing a graphical user interface. GUI, was developed in 1990 by English computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee. 1955, who wrote the web software at the CERN Physics Laboratory near Geneva, Switzerland. Berners-Lee wrote a program defining hypertext markup language, HTML. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, and Universal Resource Locators, URLs. The web became part of the Internet in 1991 and has played a major role in the growing popularity of the International Computer Network, making information more accessible to the user via multimedia interfaces, which allow the presentation of graphics, formatted text and hyperlinks, photos, and illustrations, as well as streaming or downloadable audio and video.
What was Enron?
Enron was a high-flying energy trading and communications company headquartered in Houston, Texas. It was the 7th largest corporation in the United States, a favorite on Wall Street. And for 6 years in a row, 1996 to 2001, was named America's most innovative company by Fortune magazine. Then Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December 2001. Rocking the business world and shocking investors and rank-and-file employees. It was, for a short time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Federal investigators later learned that the company's collapse was caused by fraudulent accounting practices that allowed Enron to overstate earnings and hide debts. The conglomerate had booked billions in profits that did not really exist and created mythical companies to bury heavy losses. Enron's stock price plummeted, there were massive layoffs, employee retirement accounts heavily invested in Enron stock were decimated, executives resigned, and criminal indictments followed. Its accounting firm, Chicago-based Arthur Andersen, collapsed under the weight of its involvement in the scandal. Enron soon became emblematic of a much larger problem, the so-called breakdown of corporate America. It was the first of several colossal business failures, the biggest of which was the collapse of telecom giant WorldCom. In July 2002, WorldCom, valued at $180 billion and serving 15 million customers at its 1999 peak, filed for bankruptcy. WorldCom eclipsed Enron to earn the dubious title of largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Again, fraudulent business practices were to blame. In March 2005, a federal jury convicted former WorldCom Inc. CEO Bernard Ebbers of engineering $11 billion in fraud. He was also found guilty of conspiracy and of filing false financial reports. The conviction was critical to prosecutors in a host of pending cases connected to corporate scandals, including Enron, whose former chairman, Kenneth Lay, and former CEO, Tom Skilling, were awaiting trial, set for 2006. A Fortune magazine writer reflected on the crisis of corporate ethics, saying, "Phony earnings, inflated revenues. Conflicted Wall Street analysts, directors asleep at the switch. This isn't just a few bad apples, it is a systemic breakdown." Enron happened to be first, and it became the symbol for the many. In 2005, Enron was in the process of distributing remaining assets to creditors and liquidating other operations. WorldCom, meanwhile, emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI Inc., the name of one of its subsidiaries.